In a startling and disappointing ruling by the United States Supreme Court, 5-4, led apparently by Chief Justice Roberts, the Supreme Court has just patted the Trump administration on the back effectively and has rewarded them for violating the due process rights of individuals by giving them no notice, kidnapping them, and sending them to rot in the jails of El Salvador. Because in the new ruling, while they've made the new law that in the future, anybody else that's arrested and picked up has to be given notice and some limited due process rights through what we call a writ of habeas corpus in the United States federal court where they currently reside or are confined. For those that are already sent to El Salvador in the middle of the night, they have no due process and no habeas corpus because the last time I looked, there's no U.S. federal court in El Salvador. I'll break it down for you, including the dissents, the strong dissents by Justice Sotomayor and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson that puts this thing in sharp relief. And the reality of this case is it's going to have a ricochet effect on 2 or 3 other pending matters, including those of Armando Abrego Garcia, who was deported over an asylum order that made him have to stay in the United States and not go to El Salvador, which is currently up at the United States Supreme Court as well. I'm going to cover it the only way I know how, by telling the truth here on the MeidasTouch Network. Let's break into it. Let me start you with what Ketanji Brown Jackson said about the ruling of her 5. And the 5 are, as I predicted, and we've talked at length, Alito, Thomas, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, joined by Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts. Amy Coney Barrett, once again, broke away from the pack and joined the liberal moderates in the losing side of the 5-4. You're going to see that happen. In order for free-thinking, moderate people to win at the United States Supreme Court, we got to run the table and we got to get Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. If you're on the right wing and the MAGA side, all you need is one of the two. You need 50%. You need to bat 500. We need to bat 1,000. Okay. Here's what Ketanji Brown Jackson said. The government's conduct in this litigation, the failure to properly publish the proclamation, keeping it in Donald Trump's back pocket, loading the planes with the 250 people in the middle of the night, speeding things up when they knew that the lawsuit had been filed to try to avoid the court's jurisdiction, sending off planes before the hearing at 5 o'clock, sending off planes after the court had already grounded the planes. All of that conduct to Ketanji Brown Jackson poses an extraordinary threat to the rule of law. This is on page 17 of the order of the opinion today. That a majority of this court now rewards the government for its behavior with discretionary equitable relief is indefensible. We, as a nation and a court of law, should be better than this. I respectfully dissent. Similarly, she also said, continuing, because Ketanji Brown Jackson is like one of the moral centers and voices, quickly becoming that of the United States Supreme Court, even though she's only been on for about 3 or 4 years. Here's what else she said. She talked about the procedure here. A scant record, no oral argument, no time to really deliberatively consider these issues. Why are we moving so quickly on these major issues? And she refers, in fact, to the past where the Supreme Court had made horrible, horrible mistakes that history looked back on, and the court had to eventually fix, like when the court allowed the concentration camp internment and confinement of Italian, German, and Japanese Americans during World War II. That was a bad thing. But here's what this is what she says about why are we moving so quickly. On page 2 of her dissent, I lament that the court appears to have embarked on a new era of procedural variability, and that it has done so in such a casual, inequitable, in my view, inappropriate manner. At least when the court went off base in the past, it left a record so posterity could see how it went wrong. And she cites the Karamatsu case in 1944, which allowed the internment and confinement of Japanese Americans because we were under a war hysteria. With more and more of our most significant rulings taking place in the shadows of our emergency docket, Today's court leaves less and less of a trace. Make no mistake, we are just as wrong now as we have been in the past, with similarly devastating consequences. It just seems we are now less willing to face it. That's Ketanji Brown Jackson. Here's what the majority, they didn't even sign their name to it. This is under per curiam. That's not a justice. That's just what they do when nobody wants to take responsibility for the writing here. My gut is this was written by Roberts, but that's my guess. What the fundamental result is, they completely ignore all of the bad acts in the record. They completely ignore the record of all the bad acts of the government leading into this particular hearing. And they also ignore the fact that Judge Boasberg was about to hold a hearing tomorrow on the preliminary injunction, or today on the preliminary injunction. What is the rush? Let him complete the record. Courts are not supposed to rule at the appellate Supreme Court level without complete records. So they ignore all that. They ignore the 250 people, human beings that are left to rot and die in an El Salvador jail. They do not order their return. They do not order them to come back to a federal district court in the United States, even in Texas, where they left from, in order to have this due process that they claim they're now extending by this opinion. See, they're saying, well, we gave them due process. The government agrees they should have due process and notice, but apparently not their first 250. Only those that are still in detention. And them, they have to go one at a time, go find lawyers. Let's just do a numbers game here. Under Judge Boasberg method, he certified a class so there could be one judge deciding the issue of whether there's constitutionality of this order, of this procedure, whether it violated the Administrative Procedures Act, the Fifth Amendment, and the rest. Under the world just established by the Supreme Court, there's now going to be 500, 1,000 or more, 2,000 individual habeas corpus petitions, because it's individual to the prisoner, with an individual lawyer and a judge in Texas or wherever they're picked up. And the government has the ability, as was noted by the dissent, to pick their friendly forum by just putting these people on a plane and shipping them to Texas. They don't want to be in New York, New Jersey. They want to be in Texas, in Florida. They just did it with a Columbia University graduate student who they whisked out of New York and New Jersey and sent to Louisiana and Texas. So it gives the government the advantage to stick them wherever they want. And only then, individually, one person shackled next to a lawyer, one judge, thousands of habeas petitions, including, as you can imagine, inconsistent results. One judge hearing the exact same evidence as another judge could make an entirely different ruling. And this would be individualized rulings about whether Donald Trump violated the Constitution vis-a-vis this one person, as opposed to a nationwide ruling or injunction. So this is, again, a win for the Trump administration. If you had told the Trump administration that they would be able to deport 250 people, stick them in El Salvador, and avoid all due process, and the only thing the Supreme Court would require them to do is, in the future, wherever these people are arrested or processed at that moment, which they can choose to appear individually, one at a time, before a federal judge in the venue of the court of the Trump administration's choosing, that's their wet dream. They would take it in a minute. And that's what Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor are saying about being rewarded for bad behavior. To the five on the majority and to Kavanaugh in his concurrence, he just says, well, everybody agrees up here. There's 9 of us, 9-0. They're entitled to due process and habeas corpus and Fifth Amendment, evaluation individually where they were arrested. And I defy you to read this opinion and find me one mention by the majority of the 250 people who are left to rot in El Salvador, because you will not find it. So now there's no ability. Let's talk about the ricochet effect. Boasberg had issued an order which they have now vacated at the United States Supreme Court. They just ripped up. His order was the basis for a contempt hearing. He was about to enter a contempt order against the Trump administration for willfully violating his order, continuing to fly planes after he had grounded them by his injunction. rip that up because the Supreme Court's never going to support that the underlying order was valid. So you can't violate an invalid order. So while he could try to hold them in contempt, it's never going to be supported by the Supreme Court. That's the first ricochet. The second ricochet or domino or shoe to drop is this case about Mr. Armando Abrego Garcia that's also up now at the United States Supreme Court. Roberts having issued a stay, an administrative stay, while they finish briefing today. That case is a case of a guy with a green card living with married to a U.S. citizen in Maryland, hanging out at the IKEA parking lot to try to get work, who had an order of protection in his back pocket from a immigration judge who noticed to stop him from ever being removed to El Salvador under an asylum argument, and he got deported. And the government admitted it was an administrative error, but they also admitted they can't get him back. So that case came up through Judge Zinnes in Maryland, and a decision by the Fourth District, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, who ruled 2-1 that actually 3-0 that this guy has got to be returned by midnight last night. Roberts issued a stay off the appeal by the Trump administration. The Solicitor General, Donald Trump's former criminal lawyer, filed his brief as a Solicitor General, arguing that they can't get him back. It was an error. They can't get him back. But now you have to put the two things together. He gets due process. He gets habeas corpus petition relief. He's entitled to Fifth Amendment notice, but he's in El Salvador. So here's the question. Based on this ruling, is the Supreme Court, going to rule that Abrego Garcia's got to be brought back to the United States for due process and due processing through a federal judge? Or they're going to throw up their hands and say, well, it was an error. His rights were violated, but there's nothing we can do about it because he's in El Salvador now. I think it's the latter. And that's the problem with where we're at. I said to the United States in challenging them, the Supreme Court in challenging them in a number of hot takes, what country are you going to tell us we live in where people can be, the government can defeat due process by secretly imprisoning them outside a federal court's jurisdiction? Is that the world we want to be in, to reward a government like that? As of right now, that is the ruling, 5-4. I know the headline is, Trump has to use due process and notice to use his Alien Enemies Act power, because they didn't even take on his Alien Enemies Act power at all. That is the ruling, except you have to ignore the 250 that are already rotting in that prison in El Salvador, and probably Mr. Abrego Garcia as well. And that concerned the minority, the four in the minority, including Amy Coney Barrett, about what about Abrego Garcia? What about people who were secretly deported and administrative error rotting in jails? How do you give them due process? Never addressed by the 5-4 majority. We're going to continue to follow this case and its ricochet effect on other cases that are being briefed today, like the Abrego Garcia case, and what happens with the contempt proceeding in front of Judge Boasberg now that his order has been reversed, right here on the MeidasTouch Network. And of course, on Legal AF, come on over to Legal AF MTN for all the reporting at the intersection of law and politics. Until my next report, I'm Michael Popok. In collaboration with the MeidasTouch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.